Thank you, Ashley. That's a very pretty song. And good morning and welcome to our spiritual family that's joining us online today. We like to have you here on this beautiful fall day here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we are in the last phase of our study of the book, Mightier Than Circumstance, written, actually compiled and published in 1935 by one of Unity's really foundational people, and that's Frank B. Whitney. A lot of what Whitney has written in here are stories and articles that were written in Silent Unity magazine, which we would call the Daily Word, because, as we have talked about over these last couple weeks, Whitney was the brainchild of the Daily Word magazine, and he was editor and writer for over 14 years. So there's a lot of articles that he's written, and so this is kind of in his heyday, because I think it was 1938 that Whitney died. So this is kind of the best of the best of his writings, and we've been looking through this book over the course of the month. Now let's pick up a couple themes because they will undergird the entire book. The first and foremost theme is the Christ within. Whitney is not talking about Jesus. Whitney is talking about the eternal divine principle, the Christ. It does not matter what religious faith or no faith at all. What we are talking about, if we could define this term, the Christ, it is the eternal ancient definition description of the place where the human and the divine intersect. This is the Christ, and it is within all of us, regardless of what we believe or what we don't believe, regardless of our lifestyle or our religious traditions, it makes no difference. When we talk about, in unity, Jesus Christ, what we are talking about is someone who most emulated this Christ nature, who tried to live it out to the best of his ability. And that's why we study the Gospels, that's why we study the Bible, because we want to know what Jesus knew. Ooh, that just really intrigues me. What did he know? An illiterate, itinerant preacher from the hills of Nowheresville, Galilee, that really had no exposure to a lot of culture or traditions outside of his own, and yet somehow he was able to connect with something grander, larger, greater from just his little corner on the world. And from an understanding of even a little bit, we really don't really understand what Jesus knew. I mean, we think we do. We got the Bible. But then again, even they didn't understand really what he was talking about. Because if you read Paul, Paul doesn't have the same understanding as the disciples did, and the disciples weren't the ones that wrote the 4 Gospels. It's very confusing. You know what? I have to tell you, I don't even know what's going on in my own mind, let alone somebody that's 2,000 years ago. Really. So what we look for are these patterns. The Christ within. And Whitney tells us all the way through the book, it is when we take time to awaken, to expand our consciousness, to become aware of, whatever words you want to use, in the silence, to understand that we are connected to something far larger than ourselves, that we begin to connect with the Christ within. And it's from knowing and being aware of the Christ within is where we take our understanding. It's where we have our power. It's where we have a greater appreciation and awareness of our life. The Christ within. The second thing he talks about is principle. Now, God is principle. For a lot of people, especially when you're new to Unity, feel that we've robbed you of God as personal. But remember that unity was a response and a reaction to everything was all about God, personal. So God didn't like me. God didn't answer my prayer. I had to please God. I had to appease God. I had to make God notice me. Woohoo, God, here I am. Did you notice me? I've done my prayers and I fasted and I did everything. And that was sort of the way it was in the ancient world. I had to somehow get God's attention. Ultimately, of course, what we did, as human beings always do, we created God in our image and likeness. You see, if you don't like me, then you wouldn't grant me any favors. So that's how God is. God doesn't like me, and so God didn't answer my prayer. But when we come to an understanding of God as principle, we take a quantum shift. Now, maybe the word principle to you is kind of scientific, mathematical, calculating, doesn't work for you. Let's use another word. I want to call it constant, eternal. God is the same, as the Bible says, yesterday, today, and forever. God is not changing on us. God is not thinking new thoughts. God is not being new things. God is life, love, intelligence, and power. God is not living. God is life. God is not loving. God is love. God is not intelligent. God is intelligence. And God is power. And when we can grasp that, when we begin to start saying, you know what? All that power is within me, regardless of what I've done, regardless of what I failed to do, regardless of what other people have done to me, regardless of the situation or circumstances, then I can begin to live life from an entirely different perspective. For me personally, understanding God as principle was a quantum shift in my awareness of God. Because I always was taught that God had to be, appeased and pleased. I had to do so many things, or I wasn't a good girl. I wasn't going to achieve the prize, whatever that prize was, to be in heaven afterwards. And when I began to understand that there's only one presence and one power, I began to see that we're all in this together. We're all in this great cosmic awareness that we are one, and it doesn't matter when we lived, how we lived, what we've done. We are one. And boy, I don't know about you, but for me personally, issues of forgiveness, see, I want to make you outside of me. As long as you're outside of me, I don't have to forgive you. As long as you're the bad guy, I don't have to forgive, because you're the bad guy. Don't you know? Don't you understand? That religion isn't my religion, so therefore it's not the right religion, and so I don't have to deal with you. And so the world we know is very clear about those boundaries, aren't they? And yet, all religious traditions tell us to love. All religious traditions say we are one. Well, now, wait a minute. We got a disconnect here. How is that? God is principle. God is eternal. God is almighty. God is the changeless, the timeless, the formless that undergirds all. That is a huge quantum leap in your awareness of the eternal present. It's not to say that you don't have a personal relationship to God. Oh yes, God knows your name. God knows mine too. But until we undergird that with God as principle, everlasting, ever present, we begin to think that our prayers just go nowhere, or that God isn't listening, or that God doesn't, even worse, God doesn't care. And nothing could be further from the truth. So the third thing Whitney talks about across the scope of this book, now, how are we going to train ourselves? Because really, what's going to happen here is that we need to train our mind. And in his letter to the Romans, Paul says, "Be ye transformed by what? The renewing of your mind." And Whitney tells us throughout the course of the book that our mind needs to become disciplined. And, I don't know about you, but my mind isn't all that disciplined. My mind has all these thoughts going on all the time, and I'm thinking good thoughts and bad thoughts all at the same time, and it's kind of chaotic and confusing up there, all this stuff going on. And he's saying, what we really, really have to do is we have to anchor onto these principles of truth, and we have to affirm them over and over and over again until we are convinced of their reality, not because we've convinced ourselves, but because we've had a revelation of them. So in the very first chapter of the very first book of this book, he tells us the thing just to practice on. I love these practice exercises. When you get up in the morning and you reach for the alarm, the very first thing you are to say is, it's a new world, it's a new day. It's a new world, it's a new day. Now, I don't know about you, but I go, oh, really? It's not a new world. And I go through all that negative mental process. And he's saying, you got to put that to a stop. You've got to train it. You've got to discipline it and say, no, 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 no. Hello, wait a minute. You're not listening. It's a new day, and a new world has been born because I woke up in all of my uniqueness and who and what I am to experience this day. And only I can experience this day as I can. You can't experience today for me. Only I can do it for me. And how I choose to be in today is the important task. The task of training our mind. So now as we move into the last part of the book, we're going to be talking about health. See, all this stuff starts to come together when we talk about health. The teachings in the book, as well as the early Fillmores, remember I said a couple weeks ago, are an evolutionary thought. So in the early days, we were considered very absolutist. You think it, you deny the error thought, and that was it. Remember what Whitney said in that very first chapter? If you're not healed, then whose fault was it? It was your fault, because you weren't thinking the right thing. Well, that's a little bit harsh. What we know now is it's not quite that simple, don't we? But let's come from a perspective of why they said that. If you've read any of these old Unity books, you will know that the Fillmores specifically and the early people in Unity believed in a belief that's talked about regeneration. Regeneration was the idea that when you affirm the life of the cells of your body, that the cells would never die. Well, now think about that. Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, our co-founders in Unity, a lot of people go, I can't handle that. But this is what they believed. And you must understand that in the early days of Unity, this is exactly what Myrtle Fillmore did. She affirmed the life of the cells of her body, and she was healed. She was on death's doorstep, my friends. At 43 years old, she lived another 43 years worth of health. But it's always challenging, isn't it? Because eventually what happened? Myrtle died. So could she not then continue this regeneration? What we know in Myrtle's writings, somewhere about 6 months before she died, which had been in about the summer of, I think it's 1934, she began to stop writing about regeneration, which is most interesting because we don't know why. And she would go around and tell people, I'll see you on the other side. I'm leaving. And they thought she meant something else, like she was going on a trip. But she was very clear. It was a trip, all right. It was an eternal trip that she was about to undertake and that she was going on. Can you imagine somebody walking up to you and saying, well, I'll be seeing you. Where are you going? Oh, I'm just going to do my work on the other side, is what she's quoted as saying. What, the other side of the hall? What, the other side of where are you going? But she was clear. Now, segue. Myrtle Fillmore says, you affirm the divine, perfect life, the principle of life that undergirds all in every cell of your body. 1889. Segue. 1990. Remember I said last week, we talked about the book, the groundbreaking work by Dr. Deepak Chopra, who's a medical doctor at that time, Ageless Body, Timeless Mind. And as I'm reading that book, he says, it is scientifically provable that our cells were not meant to die because they are intelligent life. And I thought, Where have I heard that before? Myrtle Fillmore, a quiet little woman without any scientific background, without any scientific education, through prayer, understands clearly that the life of every cell is meant to live forever. But what Chopra goes on to say, from a scientific point of view now in the 1990s, is that our bodies wear down through our thoughts. Our bodies wear down through practices that do not support our health, mentally, physically, and emotionally. And so we've not yet understood how the power of a cell to regenerate itself over and over and over again eternally really exists in real life. But that was our early teaching. And we understand now, and you will see this in the book a little bit, some of the quotes and affirmations that he makes. It sounds so simple. All you do is take an affirmation and you affirm life, and then you're healed. It is not that simple. Because we do have a body, and we do have a mind, and we do have emotion, and we do have a psychology, if you will, that sometimes prevents us from that realization of life. And then the question must come, what is life with a capital L anyway? Because if it's not peace, what is life? Is it really in the end all about this body? I either made it or I didn't make it because I lived in a body or I didn't live? No. And when we stand at the bedside of someone who's about to pass, what is the one thing that they need a prayer for? Peace. Peace in soul, peace in body, peace that they give into the eternal flow of life from whence they have come. You and I have all come from that flow of life, and now we simply return to it. Peace is the elemental essence of health. It isn't that we have a perfect body that is always perfect and continues to live forever. So it's interesting thoughts that he has about health, and we need to be aware of that early foundational teaching. But he's also talking about being on purpose with your life in the very end chapters of the book, which I find to be most fascinating, because he's bringing sort of all of this idea of the Christ within, of principle, and training your mind together. Because so often we believe that it's because of them, the imperial them, you name the them, I don't care who they are, those people, that illness, that injury, that financial change, that whatever it is the cause of my unhappiness. And he's saying, no. Train your mind to understand over and over and over again until you're white-knuckling it in front of the mirror. You have to remember that you were divinely created as one. Therefore, as one, you are unique. You have a place in the world that no one else can fill. And if you think someone is taking it, I always used to hear this in corporate America, they got the job I was supposed to have. No, they didn't. They got the job they were supposed to have, and you got another job waiting for you. You are being called by a divine appointment. You are here for purpose and passion. Get out your handouts and look at number 7, which is on the second side. And for those of you who are online, the handout is on our website, tulsaunity.com, under the Sunday lesson page. Look at number 7. Each has his own place to fill. I'm not getting in your way of your good. You're not getting in my way of my good. I'm getting in my own way. You're getting in your own way. All right? He says each one of us must come to the realization that his place in the great universal plan is definite and necessary. It's not a fluke. You weren't born as an accident. You are definite and necessary. He must realize that it is in the position of trying to work against the great plan if he does not feel the niche in life that is rightfully his. He must come to the realization that God has a position for him in which He alone can do the best work. Think of your position as an important one. What is that position? See, we think of it in terms of our work, but maybe we think of it in terms of the volunteer work we do. Maybe we think about it as being a grandparent or a parent. Maybe we think about it as a next-door neighbor, and we see our work. You know how sometimes you get into this, oh, geez, do I have to do this again? And instead of saying, this is important work because I'm being called uniquely to the work, isn't that a hard thing to say to your mind? I don't know about you, but there's some things, quite frankly, I don't like to do. And I fuss and I don't want to do that. I just don't want to do that. And I said, woo. Think of your position as an important one. Nothing can retard your process. You were not created by God and placed in this world to be held down by the limited thoughts of others. I don't care what they say about you. And you shouldn't either. What's that quote? What they say about me is none of my business. It's none of my business. I'm moving on. You were created and brought into the world to fill a definite place. There's an empowerment there, isn't there? That I'm just not an accident. That there is something I am to do in this world, and it's definite and it's purposeful. And the way I figure it out is through my thinking that I say to myself, I am here for purpose, and I am seeing the moment as sacred. Steadfast and immovable. The presence of Christ in you is the power that makes you steadfast and unmoved, even when the whole world about you appears to be chaotic. He said in that very last paragraph, the thing that matters most is finding the Christ within. The great principle of Christianity is not Jesus, my friends. The great principle that Jesus came to experience and to share with us is incarnation. And what incarnation means is that we are embodiment of the divine. We are the embodiment of the divine. And this body that I walk around with and the body that you walk around with is an expression and experience of the divine. Do we treat it as such? Do we see it as such? No, a lot of times we don't. But as we begin to work with these concepts and principles, we begin to understand more and more clearly that incarnation, that being in body, is our living out the principle of the Christ in human form. And that every time we suffer, every time we stumble, every time we have a success, every time things go our way and every time that they don't, we have the opportunity, even in the darkest of hours, to recognize that the body that we are in holds the light. You know, there's a cartoon I often think about. The guy in jail, and he's pushing against the door and pushing against it and pushing against it. Let me out! Let me out! And the jailer comes by and he says, back up a minute. Guy backs up and he pushes the door open. He said all he had to do was pull it in, not push it out. It wasn't locked. Pull it in, let the light out. It was never locked. The door to your awakening, to the realization of the Christ presence within you, is not locked. It takes some time, I understand that. It takes some work, and I understand that. It's a training of the mind and a discipline to see beyond the appearance of things, when sometimes it just seems like it's not good and it's not happening in the way I want it. To pull that door open, to let my light shine, and as I do, I step forward into freedom. I hope you enjoyed Frank's book. He's got a lot of good, meaty stuff in there, and this has only been kind of a sampling. But he's inviting us and encouraging us to realize that the spiritual journey is not just a few affirmations and then we go home and everything's fixed and everything's wonderful. We come together as people in a church service, I think, to remind ourselves. I don't know about you, but does life kind of grind you down? You know, it gets tough. I'm in pain, or I'm unhappy, or my job isn't going well, or my relationships are falling apart, and I need some place to come and go, okay, dust myself off and remind myself of truth, that I and you are unique human embodiments of the living Christ within. And our task, our purpose, and our life is to let that light shine. Thank you, and God bless.